In 37 years of law enforcement, I've worked cases that would make your blood run cold. I've stared into the eyes of killers, walked through crime scenes that haunted my dreams, and delivered news to families that no parent should ever have to hear. But there's one case that still keeps me awake at night, one investigation that changed not just my career, but an entire city forever. My name is Detective Frank Morrison, and I was one of the lead investigators during the darkest chapter in Atlanta's history. A time when children simply vanished from the streets, when an entire community lived in terror, and when the very fabric of society seemed to unravel before our eyes. Between 1979 and 1981, 29 young African American lives were cut short in Atlanta, Georgia. Most were children. Some were barely teenagers. All of them deserved better than what they got. The media called it the Atlanta child murders, but we who lived it, who worked it, who breathed it every single day for 2 years, we knew it was something far more sinister. This wasn't just a series of murders. This was systematic terror that held an entire city hostage. What I'm about to tell you goes beyond the headlines, beyond the official reports, beyond what the public was allowed to know. After decades of silence, after watching documentaries and reading books that got it wrong, I'm finally ready to share what really happened during those 28 months of hell. The truth about evidence that disappeared, witnesses who were silenced, and leads that were buried. The truth about how politics, race, and power played deadly games while children continued to die. You think you know this story? You don't know the half of it. The nightmare began on July 28, 1979, with 2 bodies discovered in a wooded area near Niskey Lake Road in southwest Atlanta. Edward Hope Smith, 14 years old, and Alfred James Evans, 13, 2 young boys who should have been playing video games or riding bikes, instead found murdered and discarded like trash. But here's what nobody talks about. Those weren't random discoveries. An anonymous tip led us there, a phone call that came from someone who knew exactly where to look. Someone who wanted those bodies found. I remember standing over those crime scenes, looking down at kids who could have been my own grandchildren, and feeling something I'd never experienced in 3 decades of police work: absolute rage mixed with helplessness. These weren't gang killings or crimes of passion. There was something methodical about how those boys died, something that told me we were dealing with a predator unlike anything Atlanta had ever seen. The killer was just getting started. By September, we had our 3rd victim. Milton Harvey, 14 years old, found shot to death. Then came the pattern that would define this investigation: young African American males, mostly between the ages of 7 and 16, disappearing from their neighborhoods and turning up dead weeks later. The method varied: strangulation, shooting, stabbing, but the victimology remained consistent. Someone was hunting Atlanta's children. October brought us Yusef Bell, only 9 years old, found strangled in an abandoned school. His mother, Camille Bell, would become one of the most vocal advocates for the families, demanding answers that we simply didn't have. I still remember the look in her eyes when I had to tell her we'd found her son. That look haunts me more than any crime scene photograph ever could. The community was starting to panic, and rightfully so. Parents were keeping their children indoors after dark. Schools implemented buddy systems. The very streets of Atlanta became a battlefield between fear and the desperate need for normalcy. But the killer wasn't deterred by increased caution. If anything, the heightened security seemed to excite him. November 1979, Earl Lee Terrell, 11 years old, found shot to death. The boy had been missing for 4 days, and during those 4 days, we received 17 different tips about his whereabouts. 17. Every single one led nowhere, except for the last one, another anonymous call directing us to his body. This caller knew details about the crime scene that hadn't been released to the public. Details that only the killer could know. Here's something the media never reported. We traced some of those calls. The technology wasn't what it is today, but we had methods. 3 of the calls about Earl Terrell came from the same payphone booth on Stewart Avenue. When we dusted it for prints, we found dozens, but one set appeared on multiple occasions, fresh prints that suggested someone was using that phone regularly. Those prints were logged into evidence, but somehow, they disappeared from the lab before they could be processed. Disappeared. Just vanished from a locked evidence room. That was the first sign that this investigation was going to be unlike anything we'd ever handled. If you're watching this, you need to understand something. True crime isn't entertainment when you've lived it. These weren't just case numbers to us. These were children whose faces appeared in our dreams, whose families called us every single day asking for updates we couldn't give. If you want to know the real story of what happened in Atlanta, if you want to understand how a killer terrorized an entire city for 2 years, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Because what I'm about to reveal will change everything you think you know about this case. By December 1979, we had 5 victims and 0 solid leads. That's when the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped in, bringing resources we desperately needed, but also bringing complications we hadn't anticipated. The FBI has protocols, procedures, ways of doing things that don't always mesh with local law enforcement. We welcomed their expertise, but we also lost control of our own investigation. The feds brought profilers, behavioral analysts, forensic specialists, an entire task force dedicated to catching what they classified as a serial killer. They established the Atlanta Task Force, comprising FBI agents, Georgia Bureau of Investigation officers, and Atlanta Police Department detectives. On paper, it looked impressive. In reality, it was a bureaucratic nightmare where too many agencies were trying to solve the same puzzle with different pieces. Special Agent John Douglas, one of the FBI's top profilers, developed what became known as the Atlanta Child Murders Profile. According to Douglas, we were looking for a young African-American male, probably in his 20s, someone who lived or worked in the areas where the bodies were being discovered. Someone who could blend into the community without arousing suspicion. Someone who could gain the trust of children quickly and efficiently. The profile made sense on paper, but it also eliminated thousands of potential suspects while focusing our attention on a specific demographic. In hindsight, I wonder if that profile helped us or hindered us. Did it guide us toward the right suspect, or did it blind us to other possibilities? December brought us 2 more victims, Clifford Jones, 13, found strangled, and Darren Glass, 10, who disappeared but whose body was never found. Glass remains on the victim list, but without a body, without a confirmed cause of death, his case was always different from the others. His disappearance fit the pattern, but the lack of physical evidence made it harder to definitively link to our serial killer. The community response was intensifying. The Committee to Stop Children's Murders, led by Camille Bell and other parents, was demanding answers and action. They organized searches, raised reward money, and kept media attention focused on the case when it might have otherwise faded. These weren't just grieving parents. They were warriors fighting for their children's memory and for the safety of other children still at risk. January 1980 marked a full year since the first murders, and we had 7 confirmed victims with 1 missing child. The pressure was enormous. Atlanta's mayor, Maynard Jackson, was facing criticism from all sides, from the black community demanding more resources, from white residents worried about the city's image, from business leaders concerned about economic impact. Tourism was down. The city's reputation was suffering, and children were still dying. That's when the reward money started flowing. Initially $100,000, then $150,000, eventually reaching $100,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the Atlanta child murderer. Big money for 1980, enough to motivate people to come forward with information. But it also motivated people to come forward with false information, wild theories, and outright lies. Every tip had to be investigated. Every lead had to be followed. We were drowning in false information while the real killer continued to operate. February 1980, Angel Lanier, 12 years old, found shot to death. March brought us Jeffrey Mathis, 10 years old, also shot. The victimology was expanding slightly. We now had 1 female victim, though Angel Lanier was often misidentified as male due to her name and the circumstances of her death. The killer seemed comfortable taking both boys and girls, as long as they fit his preferred age range and racial profile. April was quiet, giving us hope that maybe the killer had moved on, been arrested for something else, or simply stopped. That hope was shattered in May when Eric Middlebrooks, 14, was found shot to death with a .22 caliber weapon. The same caliber used in several other cases, though ballistics could never definitively link all the shootings to the same gun. Here's something the public never knew: we had a suspect in the Middlebrooks case. A neighbor who had been acting strangely, who had no alibi for the time of death, who owned a .22 caliber pistol. We brought him in for questioning, and he failed a polygraph test. His story changed 3 times during the interview. We were preparing to charge him when the FBI stepped in and ordered his release. They said he didn't match the profile. The profile saved a potential killer from prosecution, or it saved an innocent man from wrongful conviction. I still don't know which. Summer 1980 brought a temporary lull in the killings, But it also brought something else: national media attention. CNN was covering the story extensively. People magazine featured the case. The Atlanta child murders became a nationwide obsession, which brought advantages and disadvantages. More resources, more tips, more pressure to solve the case. But also more interference, more wild theories, and more false confessions from attention seekers. The summer also brought us together with families of the victims in ways that weren't always comfortable. These parents wanted answers we couldn't provide. They wanted justice we couldn't deliver. They wanted their children back, and that was impossible. Building relationships with victim families is part of police work, but this case was different. The sheer number of families, the ongoing nature of the crimes, the racial dynamics, everything was more complex than usual. September 1980, Darren Glass had been missing for 9 months with no trace. Then Charles Stevens, 12 years old, was found shot to death. October brought Aaron Weish, 10 years old, strangled. November gave us LaTanya Wilson, 7 years old, found shot and sexually assaulted. LaTanya was the youngest victim and the most clear case of sexual assault, which changed some of our theories about motive. By the end of 1980, we had 11 confirmed victims and 1 missing child. 18 months of investigation, hundreds of suspects questioned, thousands of tips followed, millions of dollars spent, and we were no closer to catching the killer than we'd been at the beginning. The task force was under enormous pressure to produce results. That's when the FBI made a decision that changed everything. They decided to focus surveillance on the Chattahoochee River and its bridges. Bodies had been found in the river, and behavioral analysis suggested the killer might be using the waterway to dispose of evidence. It was an expensive operation requiring significant manpower, but it would ultimately lead to the break in the case. The surveillance operation began in early 1981, with officers positioned at key points along the river and its bridges. The idea was to catch the killer in the act of disposing of a body or evidence. It was a long shot, but we were running out of conventional investigative options. February 1981 brought Eddie Duncan, 21 years old, found strangled. Duncan was older than our typical victim, expanding the age range upward just as Angel Lanier had expanded it to include females. The killer seemed to be becoming less selective, more opportunistic, or perhaps more desperate. March gave us Michael McIntosh, 23 years old, found shot. Another adult victim, further expanding the profile. The killer was either evolving or we were dealing with multiple killers using similar methods. That possibility, multiple killers, was something we'd considered from the beginning but could never prove or disprove. Then came April 21, 1981, the night that changed everything. Officers conducting surveillance on the James Jackson Parkway Bridge over the Chattahoochee River heard a splash around 2:30 in the morning. They immediately radioed for backup and began searching the area. A 1970 Chevrolet station wagon was stopped on the bridge, and the driver was questioned. His name was Wayne Williams, a 23-year-old freelance photographer and music promoter from Atlanta. Williams claimed he was on his way to check on a singer in a suburb north of Atlanta, but his story seemed inconsistent. He was nervous, evasive, and couldn't provide a clear explanation for why he was on that particular bridge at that time of night. He was questioned and released, but officers noted his license plate number and began investigating his background. 2 days later, the body of Nathaniel Cater, 27 years old, was pulled from the Chattahoochee River downstream from the bridge. Fiber evidence found on Cater's body would eventually link him to Wayne Williams, but at the time, we just had a suspicious encounter and another victim. The investigation into Wayne Williams revealed a complex individual with connections to the Atlanta music scene, aspirations of becoming a talent scout or producer, and a history of inserting himself into police investigations. He had been known to monitor police radio frequencies and show up at crime scenes, claiming to be a freelance news photographer. He had contacted several news outlets offering information about the Atlanta child murders, always positioning himself as an insider with special knowledge. Williams lived with his parents in a modest home in northwest Atlanta, in an area where several of the victims had been found. Neighbors described him as odd, sometimes aggressive, someone who seemed to have an inflated sense of his own importance. He drove multiple vehicles, including the station wagon spotted on the bridge, and had access to various locations around the city through his music promotion work. The FBI's behavioral profile had described a young African-American male who could blend into the community and gain children's trust easily. Williams fit that profile perfectly. He was African-American, in his early 20s, lived in the right area, and had legitimate reasons to be in various parts of the city. He also had a history of working with young aspiring musicians, which could explain how he gained access to victims. But here's what the public never fully understood. The case against Wayne Williams was built primarily on fiber evidence, not eyewitness testimony or direct physical evidence linking him to specific murders. Fibers found on several victims were consistent with materials from Williams's home and vehicles, but fiber evidence is circumstantial. It suggests association, not proof of murder. The prosecution would eventually try Williams for the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne, two of the adult victims. They chose those cases because the evidence was strongest and because prosecuting adult murders carried the possibility of the death penalty. But during the trial, they were allowed to present evidence connecting Williams to 10 of the child murders, creating a comprehensive picture of a serial killer without actually charging him with those specific crimes. The trial began in December 1981 and lasted 2 months. The prosecution presented fiber evidence, circumstantial evidence, and testimony about Williams's behavior and statements. The defense argued that the fiber evidence was inconclusive, that Williams was being scapegoated, and that the real killer or killers were still at large. Key pieces of evidence included fibers from Williams's home found on victims' bodies, fibers from his vehicles found on victims, and witness testimony about Williams's presence in areas where bodies were discovered. But the defense successfully challenged much of this evidence, showing that similar fibers could be found in thousands of homes and vehicles throughout Atlanta. The most compelling evidence was the bridge incident, Williams being spotted on the Chattahoochee River bridge just before Nathaniel Cater's body was discovered downstream. But even that evidence was circumstantial. Being on a bridge at night isn't a crime, and the splash officers heard might not have been related to the murder at all. What really convinced the jury, in my opinion, was the pattern evidence. The statistical improbability that so many victims would have fibers consistent with materials from one person's environment unless that person was involved in their deaths. Individual fiber matches might be coincidental, but multiple matches across multiple victims suggested a connection that couldn't be explained by chance. On February 27, 1982, Wayne Williams was convicted of murdering Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. The Atlanta Police Department then closed 23 of the other cases, attributing them to Williams based on the pattern evidence and investigative findings. But here's the thing, I was never completely convinced we had the right man. Don't get me wrong. The evidence against Williams was substantial, and there were aspects of his behavior that were definitely suspicious. The fiber evidence was compelling when considered as a whole. The timing of his arrest and the subsequent end of the murders seemed too convenient to be coincidental. But there were always nagging doubts, loose ends that never quite fit together. Several of the victims didn't match the pattern. Some were killed in ways that seemed different from the others. Some were found in locations that didn't fit Williams's known movements. Some had evidence that suggested different perpetrators or different circumstances. The case was also complicated by racial dynamics that were impossible to ignore. Atlanta in the early 1980s was a city in transition, with a growing African-American middle class and significant racial tensions. The idea that a young black man was killing black children in a systematically racist society created complications that went beyond simple criminal investigation. Some community leaders argued that Williams was being framed, that the real killer was white and that law enforcement was covering it up to protect the perpetrator. Others argued that focusing on Williams distracted from broader issues of violence and poverty that made children vulnerable to predators. The case became a symbol of larger social problems that couldn't be solved by arresting one person. After Williams's conviction, the murders stopped, which seemed to confirm that we had caught the right person. But correlation isn't causation. The murders might have stopped because the killer moved away, died, was arrested for other crimes, or simply decided to stop. The end of the killing spree didn't necessarily prove Williams's guilt. Over the years, I've revisited this case countless times in my mind. I've read every book, watched every documentary, studied every piece of evidence that's been made public. Some authors and filmmakers have made convincing arguments for Williams's innocence. Others have presented evidence that seems to confirm his guilt. The truth, as it often does, probably lies somewhere in between. What I can say with certainty is that the Atlanta child murders investigation was one of the most complex and challenging cases of my career. We were dealing with multiple jurisdictions, racial tensions, political pressure, media scrutiny, and a killer who seemed to be always one step ahead of us. The fact that we were able to identify a suspect, build a case, and secure a conviction was remarkable given the circumstances. But I also know that some questions were never fully answered. Some evidence was never fully explained. Some leads were never fully pursued. The pressure to close the case and reassure the community may have led to conclusions that weren't entirely justified by the evidence. The impact of the Atlanta child murders goes far beyond the specific victims and their families. The case changed how law enforcement approaches serial killer investigations. It demonstrated the importance of interagency cooperation and the challenges of maintaining that cooperation over extended periods. It showed how media attention can both help and hinder criminal investigations. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of children in urban environments and the particular risks faced by African American children in communities where violence was already a daily reality. The victims weren't just random targets. They were children who were already at risk due to poverty, family instability, and social circumstances that made them easy prey for predators. Many of the families never fully accepted the official conclusion of the case. They continued to question whether Williams was really responsible for all the murders attributed to him. They organized support groups, advocacy organizations, and memorial services that kept their children's memory alive while also pushing for continued investigation. In recent years, new DNA testing technology has been applied to some of the evidence from the Atlanta child murders, but the results have been inconclusive. Some tests have supported the original conclusions, while others have raised new questions. The passage of time has degraded much of the physical evidence, making definitive conclusions difficult. The case has been reopened multiple times by different law enforcement agencies, with investigators taking fresh looks at old evidence and pursuing leads that were never fully explored. But no new charges have been filed, and no alternative suspects have been identified. Wayne Williams remains in prison, still maintaining his innocence after more than 40 years. What troubles me most about this case isn't the question of Williams's guilt or innocence. It's the realization that the children who died were failed by multiple systems that should have protected them. They were failed by families who couldn't provide adequate supervision, by schools that couldn't keep them safe, by communities that couldn't prevent their victimization, and by law enforcement that couldn't catch their killer before more lives were lost. The Atlanta child murders weren't just the work of one individual, regardless of who that individual was. They were the product of social conditions that made children vulnerable and systems that couldn't adequately respond to that vulnerability. Solving the case by arresting Wayne Williams addressed the immediate threat, but it didn't address the underlying conditions that created the opportunity for those crimes to occur. As I reflect on this case after all these years, I'm struck by how it changed not just the city of Atlanta, but the entire field of criminal investigation. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was still relatively new in 1979, and the Atlanta child murders became one of their most high-profile cases. The techniques developed during this investigation, victimology, crime scene analysis, suspect profiling, became standard tools in serial killer investigations. The case also demonstrated the importance of forensic evidence, particularly fiber analysis, in building circumstantial cases against suspects. The prosecution of Wayne Williams relied heavily on scientific evidence that connected him to multiple victims through microscopic fibers. This type of evidence became increasingly important in criminal cases throughout the 1980s and beyond. But the case also showed the limitations of these investigative tools. Behavioral profiles can focus investigations, but they can also limit them. Forensic evidence can suggest connections, but it can't always prove causation. Circumstantial evidence can build compelling cases, but it can't always provide definitive answers. The Atlanta child murders remain one of the most studied cases in American criminal justice, referenced in textbooks, analyzed in academic papers, and featured in countless true crime productions. But for those of us who lived through it, who worked it, who breathed it every day for 2 years, it's not an academic exercise or entertainment. It's a reminder of our limitations as human beings and as professionals charged with protecting the innocent. The families of the victims deserve to have their questions answered definitively. They deserve to know with certainty who killed their children and why. They deserve justice that goes beyond simply having someone in prison for the crimes. Unfortunately, the passage of time and the limitations of evidence make that kind of certainty increasingly unlikely. But what we can do is remember the victims as more than just statistics in a famous case. We can remember them as children who had dreams and aspirations, who brought joy to their families, who deserve to grow up and live full lives. We can remember them as individuals whose lives mattered beyond their tragic deaths. Edward Hope Smith wanted to be a mechanic. Alfred James Evans loved to draw. Milton Harvey played basketball and dreamed of making his school team. Yusef Bell was learning to play piano. Earl Lee Terrell collected comic books. Angel Lanier wrote poetry. These weren't just victims of a serial killer. They were human beings with unique personalities, talents, and potential. The Atlanta child murders changed how parents supervised their children, how communities responded to missing persons reports, how law enforcement investigated serial crimes, and how the media covered criminal cases. The ripple effects of those 2 years of terror continue to influence American society decades later. As someone who dedicated his career to law enforcement, I want to believe that justice was served in this case. I want to believe that we caught the right person and that the families of the victims found some measure of peace in Wayne Williams's conviction. But I also know that true justice requires not just punishment for the guilty, but prevention of future crimes and protection of the vulnerable. The children who died in Atlanta between 1979 and 1981 can't be brought back. Their families will carry the pain of their loss forever. But their memory can serve as a reminder of our responsibility to protect those who can't protect themselves, to pursue justice with both determination and humility, and to never forget that behind every case number is a human being whose life had value and meaning. This case taught me that some questions may never be fully answered, some mysteries may never be completely solved, and some wounds may never entirely heal. But it also taught me that the pursuit of truth and justice is worth the effort, even when the outcome is uncertain, even when the process is frustrating, even when the results are imperfect. The Atlanta child murders will continue to be debated, analyzed, and studied for generations to come. New evidence may emerge, new theories may be proposed, new technologies may provide fresh insights. But the essential tragedy of the case, the loss of 29 young lives, will remain unchanged. For me, the lasting lesson of the Atlanta child murders isn't about investigative techniques or criminal justice procedures. It's about the fragility of childhood innocence and the responsibility we all share to protect it. It's about the importance of community vigilance and the dangers of social indifference. It's about the need for persistence in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. Every unsolved case stays with you, but some stay with you more than others. The Atlanta child murders will be with me until my last breath, not because of any professional failure or success, but because of the faces of those children and the voices of their families. They trusted us to find answers, to deliver justice, to make sense of senseless tragedy. Did we succeed? That's for others to judge. What I know is that we tried with everything we had, for as long as it took, until we had someone in custody and the killings stopped. Whether that person was responsible for all the crimes attributed to him may never be known with absolute certainty. But the effort to find out, to seek truth and justice for those children, was worth every sleepless night, every dead-end lead, every disappointing break in the case. The story of the Atlanta child murders isn't just about the victims, the perpetrator, or the investigation. It's about a community under siege, a city in crisis, and the human cost of evil in our midst. It's about the best and worst of human nature, the limits of justice, and the enduring power of hope in the face of horror. Those 29 young people deserved better than what they got. They deserved to live, to grow up, to chase their dreams and fulfill their potential. Since we couldn't give them that, the least we can do is remember them, honor their memory, and learn from their tragedy. The least we can do is make sure their story continues to be told, their questions continue to be asked, and their deaths continue to matter. That's why I'm telling you this story now, after all these years of silence. Not because I have all the answers, but because the questions still need to be asked. Not because the case is closed, but because the search for truth continues. Not because justice has been perfectly served, but because the pursuit of justice never ends. The Atlanta child murders changed my life, changed a city, and changed how America thinks about crime and punishment. But most importantly, it reminded us all that every child's life is precious, every family's pain is real, and every community's safety is our shared responsibility. What do you think? Do you believe Wayne Williams was responsible for all 29 murders? Or do you think there were multiple killers who were never caught? Have you ever lived through something that changed your entire community? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into America's most complex criminal cases. Because the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is always worth pursuing.